can start.
Okay. Greetings from Istanbul. My name is Michael Wayne. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak to the Labour and Communications Conference. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and I think there'll be a chance afterwards to have a question and answer session. So I'm going to be talking about the media and the crisis, and I'm talking about what I want to do is situate the media in relation to the political and economic crisis, understanding that the media are both embedded in the political and economic crisis and reproduce the crisis within the terms of the system, but that also the media, because the system is contradictory, the media also produce fractures within the system that radicals can use, both at political ideological level and also at a economic and technological level. So the crisis, the economic crisis, has two dimensions. There's the boom-bust cycle that is endemic to capitalism, and the media are implicated in that. The crisis, the other dimension of the economic crisis, is, of course, the long-term downward pressure on the rate of profit, which the media are also implicated in, and I'll sort of come back to that and give some indications of how that's the case. Perhaps media scholars are generally more interested in the role of the media in the political and ideological crisis. And here, this is a crisis really of representative democracy that is international. There are four, I think, main features of this crisis of representative democracy. First of all, there's the consensus politics, a consensus built around a neoliberal policy program. There's the decline in political accountability, but also as more and more territory, social and economic territory, is passed over to the control of the corporations, declining accountability right across society. There's declining levels of participation in mainstream politics, at least, although that might be seen from another angle as a positive thing, as people lose some of their illusions about mainstream politics as a vehicle for change. And there's the rise of public opinion manipulation, spin, PR and propaganda that is endemic to political communication under capitalism. Now, the concept of neoliberalism is a useful one. It helps us periodize the latest phase of capitalism that we're in, but it's interestingly not one that's used very often, at least in the UK media. I could only find 389 references to the concept of neoliberalism in the UK quality broadsheet media in press over a 14-year period. So between 2000 and 2014, there are only 389 references to the concept of neoliberalism. And that's interesting, I think, because the concept does help people get a handle on what's happening in the latest phase of capitalism. It doesn't represent a single unified program, neoliberalism, but it's easy enough to identify some of the key principles and policy instruments that are driving neoliberalism forwards. So I have 6 that I think are particularly germane. First of all, neoliberalism is extending commodification throughout all areas of life, in housing, education, health and culture. All these areas are being turned over to commodity exchange. And rolling back, really, the gains that were made in earlier periods where social obligations were put on capital, not only rolling back those gains, but also locking them in and making them quite difficult to reform in the future. of course, that's quite double-edged, of course, because if you make reform of capitalism difficult, it could push people into taking more radical measures. But the rollback and the locking in takes place particularly at sort of international levels, political, legal and economic levels. So, for example, at the legal level, developing international standardizing international laws and regulations. At the political level, creating parastate structures. And at the economic level, meshing economic systems. I guess I'm thinking particularly here of the EU, which is probably the most advanced institutionalization of neoliberalism at an international level. And the media here are implicated in this because it's very important that the consensus amongst the political elites is mirrored by the media. The media index the range of voices which they allow into their channels to the range of voices that are speaking in the mainstream politics. So, therefore, the debates within the media are constrained within the framework that is set up by the political elites, by the media commentariat, policy makers and opinion formers. And so this reproduces this kind of consensus politics. The other second feature of neoliberalism is the penetration of national economies by foreign capital. And this both intensifies competition and also diminishes accountability across the board. So again, now in relation to the media, a good example of this is Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, which has substantial presence in the UK broadcasting and press media. Murdoch owns British Sky Broadcasting, or owns a chunk of it. I'm going to come back to B Sky B later, but also controls the Times, the Sunday Times, the Sun newspaper, and formerly the News of the World. And also, of course, Murdoch has press and broadcasting interests globally, across Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Canada and the US, where he also owns 20th Century Fox, amongst a number of other smaller film companies. So this is kind of global penetration of media markets by Murdoch. The third feature, I think, of neoliberalism is its attempt really to increase the concentration of ownership amongst fewer companies, despite all the kind of noises that are made towards increased competition and so on, implying sort of plurality of companies. Really, the tendency of neoliberalism is to increase concentration of ownership through privatization and deregulation. And in the case of the media, the paradigm case of this was in America, where from the 1980s onwards, under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, decades of Keynesian regulations that had kept film and television and cable companies separate, that started to be rolled back and was consummated really in the 1996 Telecommunications Act that was signed into law by President Clinton. And really over this 15 or 20 year period, we saw a wave of mergers and acquisitions, media companies owning lots of the media, horizontally and vertically integrated. And out of this process emerged, some of the giants of the media world today that that sort of dominate the global media market: Sony, Time Warner, Disney, and again Murdoch's News Corporation. Fourthly, neoliberalism, you see a deepening integration between capital and state. particularly where the capital is feeding off public revenues, developing a kind of rentier capitalism, and that also in turn is likely to promote political corruption as capital buys its way to contracts and influence over policy making. And again, the paradigm case in the UK is Rupert Murdoch, whose access to a succession of British prime ministers was famous or infamous. And of course, the weapon that Murdoch had was his control of the tabloid press, particularly the Sun and the News of the World, with very high circulation figures in excess of 3 million. And politicians were terrified of the kind of power which and influence that Murdoch could wield. Fifthly, I think neoliberalism works to erode opposition to the neoliberal programme. And it does this by either attacking points of resistance to neoliberalism or ignoring, silencing and marginalising resistance. So in terms of attacking resistance, the media have played for a long time now a very important role in orchestrating support for strengthening legal and police powers in a process that Stuart Hall famously termed authoritarian populism. That is to say, to build a consensus whereby state and corporate power over people actually becomes perversely popular amongst the people themselves. In terms of ignoring resistance, I mean, that's to some extent being countered by the rise of social media, but nevertheless the power of the mainstream media to kind of silence dissent by ignoring and marginalising it remains an effective one. In the UK, for example, there's been very little media coverage of the not-so-slow privatisation of the National Health Service. And most members of the British public are not aware of what's going on in relation to the National Health Service in terms of tendering out contracts and changing the way it works, increasing competition and so forth. Even the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, which is publicly funded and which has very high trust levels amongst the TV audience and is massively dominant in terms of its share of the audience, would be very influential if it kind of actually informed people, but has actually kind of ignored the issue and has been silent on it. So that's a very significant weapon. Finally, in terms of the kind of neoliberalism, there's the media have been very important in kind of pushing a specific ideological value system associated with neoliberalism. Firstly, around workers coming to accept a new kind of environment in which they're supposed to be endlessly flexible, that is endlessly open to exploitation by capital, in which they're supposed to be performative, in the sense that they're supposed to be constantly demonstrating their qualities, their talents, their productiveness to various assessments, monitoring assessments on their performance. What's also happening is that in neoliberalism lionises and celebrates the entrepreneur, the individual entrepreneur. The corporation is much harder to kind of build levels of trust around, and there's a lot of widespread public scepticism about the corporation, but it's the individual entrepreneur that neoliberalism sort of tries to build up as these fantastic wealth creators and innovators. And also the counterpart to that individualization is that the worker themselves must accept their social fate as entirely their own individual responsibility, so that whatever structural social problems they have must really be seen only as challenges that they can overcome with a sufficiently can-do attitude. Okay, so what I want to speak about now a little bit is a kind of case study on the hacking crisis that overwhelmed Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation in the UK in 2011, because it's quite instructive. It illuminates a lot of the features of this neoliberal landscape that I've just been talking about. So what happened, the story there is that Rupert Murdoch wanted to take complete control of British Sky Broadcasting. He currently owns around 40% of Sky B. To take complete control would have been an £8 billion deal, and it would have been the biggest media deal in UK history. And although there was clearly a lot of disquiet about the deal, a lot of people were very opposed to giving Murdoch more power, more presence, more influence in the UK media. It was quite clear that the coalition government of Tories and Liberal Democrats were going to wave the deal through until a story, there had been a slow burn story about hacking going on for some time, that the News of the World, a title owned by Murdoch, had engaged in hacking people's phones. It was mostly kind of associated with celebrities. But then the story broke that the News of the World had hacked the phone of a dead girl, a teenager called Millie Dowler, who had been murdered in 2002. And between her disappearance and her body being found, the News of the World hacked her phone. The public revulsion in response to that was so overwhelming that the Sky B deal was killed stone dead. And the fallout has been impressive. First of all, the head of the Metropolitan Police resigned, as did the next day his assistant commissioner. Then Rebecca Brooks, the CEO of News International, resigned. Then the News of the World was shut down. And then, finally, James Murdoch, chairman of Sky B, also resigned. As a result of all this scandal, the government was forced to set up a judge-led inquiry called the Leveson Inquiry, that was to look at the practices and ethics of the press. And there's Rupert attending the inquiry. Nice picture of him saying what he thinks of it. And it was interesting. The inquiry did lay bare, and in an extraordinary public way, the nexus of relationships, the power relationships between the politicians and the media. So, for example, we found out how close the Culture Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, was to the corporations, to Murdoch's News Corporation. Now, Jeremy Hunt was the Culture Secretary at the time, and he was in charge of overseeing the bid for Sky B. In other words, that he would make the judgment as to whether or not it was in the public interest or not. And he was supposed to be in what was called a quasi-judicial role, which is to say that he was supposed to be, independent, just look at the evidence, and the whole ideology of objectivity and political neutrality that is common in the sort of legal discourse. And he was supposed to be in this role. But what we found out through the Leveson inquiry was just how close Jeremy Hunt was. We found out that his special advisor, a man appropriately named Adam Smith, was in daily contact with the chief lobbyist at News Corporation. exchanging texts, phone messages and so forth. And this special advisor, Adam Smith, was handpicked by Jeremy Hunt. There's no question that he was incredibly close to Jeremy Hunt, and it's virtually impossible to believe that he was feeding information back to the chief executive that wasn't cleared by Hunt. And one of the things that we, at one point in the process, the media regulator, Ofcom, had suggested that it may not be in the public interest for the B-Sky-B deal to go through. And in response to that, Frederick Michael, the chief lobbyist at News Corporation, this was an email that the Leveson inquiry got access to. And as it says there, spoke to Hunt. Whether he spoke directly to Hunt or to Adam Smith, we don't know, but spoke to Hunt. He made again a plea to try and find as many legal errors as we can in the Ofcom report and propose some strong and, inverted commas, I like that, impactful remedies, i.e. window dressing, would welcome other comment articles from, and then names two people, Littlewood and Elstein, in coming days, both former executives at B-Sky-B. So here we have the Culture Secretary, supposed to be in a quasi-judicial role, asking News Corporation to help him build a case whereby he can give the go-ahead to the B-Sky-B deal. So, I mean, Marxists used to be criticised for suggesting that politicians were kind of glove puppets for corporate capital, and people would say, well, it's not that simple. There's more autonomy for the political realm. But I mean, this autonomy was socially constructed, but that sort of political autonomy has in fact been dismantled by neoliberalism over the last few years. Okay, so at the moment, there's a trial going on in London. Rebecca Brooks, the former CEO of News International, is on trial. She's also a former editor of the News of the World, and also on trial is another former editor of the News of the World, Andy Coulson, who went on to become David Cameron's the Prime Minister's chief media spokesperson. He obviously had to resign as this scandal kind of broke out. So that, again, the revolving door between the politicians and the media. So they're on trial along with a number of other reporters for hacking. So one of the things that we have to ask really is, how did an incredibly powerful media empire be brought so low so quickly? Because effectively, for at least temporarily, Murdoch's political power in the UK has been broken. Well, we can answer that by looking at some of the contradictions within the system. So first of all, even though we are talking about oligopoly capitalism, there is still intercapitalist competition, and that's very important, because intercapitalist competition between capitalists, produces ideological fissures and ideological conflicts which radicals can sort of use, and those discourses kind of circulate in society. So in terms of the media, an unprecedented coalition of press and broadcasting interests came together to try and block the B-Sky-B deal, because they recognised that it would be against their collective interests for Murdoch to become any more powerful. And The Guardian, of course, played a very key role in pushing the hacking story to the fore of public consciousness. This intercapitalist competition also rests on another kind of contradiction. The contradiction between bourgeois law and bourgeois economics. I mean, bourgeois law is supposed to regulate the relationships between capitalists and workers, between capitalists and capitalists, between capitalists and state, and capitalists and private citizens. The problem, of course, is that although the bourgeois law is supposed to be universal, bourgeois economics only recognises the private interests of the individual organisation and its desire to accumulate. And so as these organisations become larger and more powerful, so the temptation is to cross the legal line, to break the laws. And they have the power and the means to do that. So, for example, in terms of intercapitalist competition, everyone knows that industrial sabotage is really quite rife and is part of the capitalist game. And, of course, industrial sabotage is one of the allegations that has been levelled at Murdoch's News Corporation in relation to satellite competitors. Then there's also the question of the relationship between capitalists and the state. And again, Rupert Murdoch's corporation has been accused of bribing public officials, or employees have been accused of employees of News Corporation have been accused of bribing public officials. And then the relationship between capitalists and the private citizen, well, that takes us back to the whole hacking scandal. To understand what drove the news world to break the law, you have to understand the type of journalism that we have in the UK. And I think we can divide it up into three types. First of all, there is investigative journalism, the kind of classic version that journalism has of itself. And of course, investigative journalism is something that we have every reason to defend and cherish and so on, but it's expensive and no one can pretend that investigative journalism constitutes the norm of what the mainstream capitalist media produce, or constitutes the normal relationship that the mainstream media have with the state. No, really, there are two other types of journalism that are by far the most predominant. So the first is what we might call sort of network embedded journalism. And this is the journalism that is involved in the kind of daily reportage of the comings and goings of the political elites, their announcements and their activities. Many journalists fondly seem to think of themselves as guardians of the fourth estate, but nothing could be further from the truth. Really, this kind of embedded journalism reproduces the vocabulary of neoliberalism without criticism. So, words like modernisation, choice, efficiency, and so on and so forth, they're never really interrogated for what they really mean. And what they really mean is, increased privatisation, social stratification, and profiteering. So this journalism is really associated mostly with the kind of quality broadsheet papers in the UK. The third type of journalism that we have in the UK is a kind of tabloid journalism, which I understand that you don't really have this kind of journalism in Turkey, and it's probably just as well because in the UK it's contributed to eroding and corroding sort of the public sphere and public debate. This is the journalism of voyeurism, the journalism of covering the sexploits of celebrities, although also, as in the case of Millie Dowler, occasionally they intrude into the lives and tragedies of ordinary citizens as well. Now, this split between the sort of embedded journalism of the quality press and the tabloid press speaks to really the stratification in society generally. It's very much split along class lines. So you have a quality press for the middle class. They're the ones who are addressed as citizens. They're the ones who are given, some kind of information about what's going on in society. They're the ones who are addressed as people who have a kind of political dimension to their lives, political participation. Whereas the tabloid press really speak to their readers as consumers, not people who are supposed to be interested in politics, and insofar as they do have an interest in politics, it's presented to them as a kind of grotesque spectacle. So this, there is a kind of this social stratification really speaks to a kind of post-social democratic state, one that isn't really interested in the majority of people having an interest in politics. At most, it's just an elite minority that are supposed to be interested in politics, and they're kind of fed a diet of this kind of, embedded journalism. Obviously, there are economic pressures on the media that might also be responsible for pushing the tabloid press in certain directions. There's been the historic long-term, gradual but still long-term decline in circulation figures, and also the migration of advertising revenue online, which some papers are trying to reconstruct themselves as online media. That brings us to the question of online and digital capitalism, brings us to the economic dimensions of the crisis, which I also want to talk about, because there's been a lot of hope and money that's been invested in high-tech companies, in digital media, information technology. The hope is that the information technology will drive fresh rounds of profit and growth for the capitalist system. But will it? The 1990s, the sort of promise of the dot-com boom coincided with high growth of profit rates in the United States. But all that rapidly turned to dust in the early 2000s with the dot-com collapse. So here you have the media being implicated in the boom-bust cycle of capitalism. But today, high-tech stocks are trading at record levels, and one might suggest that Wall Street is again indulging in irrational exuberance. When one looks at the business model of Amazon and Facebook, it's quite hard to see what they're adding in terms of value creation. In terms of Amazon, for example, it uses internet and IT really to work as a distributor. And working as a distributor, that means that they're basically squeezing producers, putting goods out there on a discount, and they can only do that by squeezing a bit of value from the producers. You could argue that in expanding the market, that's where the sort of value is being expanded. However, the share price to earnings ratio in the case of Amazon is 612. So that represents a massive speculative bet by Wall Street on a future that may never actually materialize. Same with Facebook, over 1.2 billion users. It's really, this is just an advertising model. It's taking value that's been accumulated elsewhere and then is redistributed through advertising. Facebook is capturing that. We've seen a recent 3% drop on the share prices of some of the big high-tech companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Netflix, LinkedIn, and so on. And one reason for that sudden drop might be concerns about the future. A lot of people think that the stock market is really being underpinned by the Treasury, the US Treasury, the bank doing quantitative easing. And people realise that analysts realise that can't go on indefinitely. At some point, quantitative easing has to stop. And when it does so, what will be the real health of the stock market? The fact that there was a recent 3% drop on share prices of high-tech goods indicates that the digital media, the high-tech companies, IT, is part of the paradigm. It's not outside the usual dynamics of capitalism, and people are as concerned about that sector as they are about any other. Another way of thinking about how high-tech digital capitalism is embedded in the capitalist process and not really a new paradigm is to look at the amount of cash hoarding that these tech companies do. So at the end of 2013, Apple had 147 billion cash hoard registered on its balance, on its books, and that represented 56% of its overall assets. Google had 54.7 billion, and that represented 52% of its assets. And Microsoft had 80 billion cash hoard, and that represented 56% of its assets. To me, this indicates that the downward pressure on the rate of profit is as evident on the high-tech companies as it is across the other sectors as well. Tech companies operate like all companies in any sector. They're affected by the same dynamics. So, for example, Apple offshored manufacturing to China, as did other manufacturers. But again, this is a short-term, time-limited fix for the problems around the declining rate of profit. There are rising worker wages in China. The workforce is declining relative to the overall size of the population. The value of the Chinese currency is rising, and that's going to make exports more expensive. And all this will take its toll on manufacturing, on the manufacturing industry, including the high tech, and will depress the rate of profit. So I don't think there's going to be digital capitalism is going to save capitalism at all. Now, I've been talking about indicating how digital media, the media in general, has contributed to the centralisation and consolidation of capital, but there has also been economic technological developments that have played a reverse role, a decentralising role, decentralising the means of production and distribution into the hands of people outside the media corporations. And this has opened up a critique of the mainstream media that's migrated out of the academy and has gone into the streets, gone into activists who have become media producers and the wider public. And this decentralisation has also enhanced the organisational capacities of alternative political groups by giving them alternative channels of communication. We've also seen through information technology developments the cheapness with which information can be reproduced close to zero cost. This has had an effect in two ways. First of all, it's had an economic effect. There's definitely been a kind of leakage of exchange value around a lot of digital goods. But perhaps more importantly, it's also led to kind of ideological fissures because it's seeded into the public sphere. The idea that private property rights, in perpetuity or over many decades, or even for short periods, is questionable. And I would say, more and more layers of the wider public internationally are less enamoured of private property rights in relation to information goods than they were in the past. So that's an interesting development. Now, just finally then, although some of the work by people like Yochai Benkler and Jeremy Rifkin does sort of veer towards technological determinism, their arguments about how new technology has led to a conquest of scarcity, that's a trend which you find in Marx's argument, especially in the Grundrisse. And as Marx puts there in the Grundrisse, to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labour time and on the amount of labour employed than on the power of the agencies set in motion during labour time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all proportion to the direct labour time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and on the progress of technology or the application of this science to production. So what Marx is sort of arguing there is that that labour inputs are diminishing. There's less labour time in terms needed in terms of the outputs. Less has to go in, and you produce more. Now that's a conquest of scarcity, which means that labour time is going to, prices and costs are going to kind of uncouple. The costs no longer bear much relationship to the prices, and that does produce a kind of economic and ideological problem for capitalism. And as Marx puts it, as soon as labour in the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labour time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and hence exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. And it is interesting that information goods have been at the forefront of that trend. So one of the major contradictions of capitalism is that the search for value accumulation, which leads to incessant productivity changes, actually in the end undermines capitalist social relationships. So with that, that's me finished, and I think now we can maybe take some questions. Okay, so question one: What are alternatives in class struggles other than we have witnessed after 2008? Is there anything labour class have ignored? I mean, I guess that's probably speaking to the whole sort of question of the social movements, the Occupy movements, and the here in Turkey there's the incredible importance of the struggles around Gezi Park, and the relationship of those kind of social movements that are taking place outside kind of traditional working class organisations. I mean, personally, my feeling here, if I'm answering the question interpreting the question correctly, my feeling is that what we need are both kind of social movements that are independent of the state and independent of political parties, but also that labour, the working class, do need political parties as well in order to achieve power. In order to achieve power and leverage political change, leverage resources, leverage changes in legal relationships that will encourage other forms of common property. So I think these two these two forms of struggle need to be articulated. My kind of model of this really sort of comes from my experience in Venezuela, where I spent a year in 2008. And to me, what I saw there was that the social movements were incredibly important and independent in driving the revolution forward. But at the same time, there wouldn't have been really any change without acquiring political power, and that meant a political vehicle, political party. Of course, tensions between the political party and the social movements, but I think that's kind of inevitable, really. So another question: can we say that this crisis of capitalism is an opportunity to generate a class consciousness on a global scale? Well, yes. I mean, I think one of the important things is to rehabilitate socialism. I mean, it is striking to me that the crisis in Greece, for example, it's still not clear how that's going to pan out, but it is possible that it could pan out that the old order will, stay in control. I mean, they've had so many general strikes there. In another period, you would have thought this would have been a revolutionary conjuncture. And I think to some extent, the reason it isn't is because there is a sense in which, well, what is the alternatives? And the sense that the delegitimization of socialism has kind of undermined the sense that there are alternatives. Of course, there are also very powerful, that's kind of ideological level, but there are, of course, very powerful material, economic and political reasons why Greece has kind of been locked into the austerity program, and that sort of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier on in terms of the EU, kind of institutionalizing neo-liberalism. But yes, any crisis is of course an opportunity, and we don't know how that will develop. We don't know where the movements are going to go next. It is a very open and fluid situation at the moment. Another question: all around the world there are economic but also social and political crises in the last couple of years. In this context, what elites in politics and media are doing to recreate their credibility? Yeah. I mean, it is interesting that the crisis, it hasn't, in many ways, it hasn't, at least in the UK, it hasn't actually led to a crisis in neoliberalism at an ideological level. The crisis seems to be at an economic level. But in fact, what they're doing is they're using the crisis to actually push their program even further and deeper. So, I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really. So there isn't necessarily a kind of movement from an economic crisis to an ideological crisis. I mean, maybe there is in some parts, as in Greece, but in other parts they're managing to. I think I come back to the question that it's the TINA. There is no alternative. That's the line that they constantly go for. There cannot be any policy alternatives to the one that we're pursuing. So in the UK, they'll talk about we're all in this together. There's a crisis. There's austerity. We have to budget. We have to make cuts, and so on and so forth. The fact that Britain remains a very wealthy country, and that the wealthy have seen their wealth increase over the last few years, that's quite hard to break through, and it's quite hard to break through because of the mainstream media are just not interested in shining a light on the capitalist class. People might talk about inequality. I mean, that will certainly come into the equation, but the link between people being poor and people being rich is not something that the media themselves will draw attention to that often, that people are poor because people are rich. It's as if, well, there's just inequality for some reason that we can't quite fathom. What do you think about the social structure after the crisis? Will there be a new kind of Keynesianism? Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think it'd be very foolish to rule out the possibility that capitalism could take that direction. However, as I said, to some extent, they're locking in the changes, the neoliberal changes, so they're making it difficult for that to happen. Also, I mean, people have made the argument that there was very special and peculiar conditions for the rise of Keynesianism. And really, if you look at the kind of the history of capitalism over 250 years, you could really read it as, well, the Keynesian moment was a kind of blip. It took, you know, the depression of the 1930s, but even then, not just that, but also the Second World War to provide both the kind of economic sort of uplift which this mass organisation of war requires, and all the kind of sort of huge investment that required. That was the kind of the platform on which Keynesianism could be based, and it also, of course, did mean that, you know, elites were frightened when the war was over. People were coming back to their respective countries. You know, these were people who had fought in the war. They were trained soldiers now, and, you know, there was a sense amongst the elites, well, if we don't give them something, if we don't make concessions, you know, we could face a full-scale revolution, and that in various ways was, you know, felt in different countries around Europe, in particular. So that's, you know, it's hard to see how that particular situation could happen again. So it's possible that the kind of Keynesian moment can't really return. But if that's the case, then, you know, what are the alternatives? You know, are we in a situation where basically capitalism has really lost the capacity to reform, to concede reforms? I mean, you know, if it is the case that economically it is sicker than ever, then you know, that puts a lot of pressure on the system. And if that's the case, if it can't reform itself, then I guess you know, that raises the question. Well, you know, the changes would have to be more radical, more revolutionary. But you know, across Europe, we're a long way from that, I think, especially from where I speak from coming from the UK. I think most people hope that there can be some kind of reform of the system. But whether there can be, I don't know. Now, I don't know if there are any more questions.